crying. Learning doesn't occur well when they're in that state. It's not a conducive space for paying attention. It's a conducive space for worrying about and trying to make sure you damage control. All right, I'm really off, I'm sorry. One of the things that's going to happen is we're going to do some contemplative practice. I'm going to bring out the meditation cushions. We're going to get the malas out. We're going to start clicking away. Or we're going to do what actually is the translation of these. Gom, bhavana, these esoteric, mystical practices to cultivate, to familiarize. Repetition. Neurons that fire together, wire together. It is a conditioned response. Just as stress is conditioned, so is kindness and compassion. We can shift that. So we're going to engage in research-based practices, such as journaling, such as reflection, such as taking a moment and a few deep breaths. These are just as important contemplative practices as anything else. So we can demystify a lot of this and recognize that the science is bearing out to tell us that we can be well, and there are steps we can take.
Are explaining something that is an interesting phenomenon, and that schools that use disciplinary removals heavily, we know that disciplinary removals will tend to negatively affect the outcome of the children being removed, but we also see an academic effect on the children who are left in the class. And I've never heard it explained in any other way than which I think I could extrapolate from what you're saying, is that there's some, non-neurally.
Trauma kind of is contagious in terms of what that happens. And the movement towards restorative practices means that if I do something that is assaulting to someone, there is a reverberating effect across the board, right? That's why we recognize, hey, what is the harm that I created with this person? Well, what is the harm that was created with the community?
And this is something you're expected to work into the curriculum.
Absolutely. One of our primary objectives is to bring in restorative practice. I'll make some connections if we have enough time to that. But I do think that point you made, and one of my favorite research studies is actually occurred in New York, and it was a meta-study that it was also longitudinal, and it took about 500,000 kids. This data is wild, and it's true. So it feels like but I can substantiate this. If a child is suspended for even a single day between the second half of their 8th grade year or the first half of their 9th grade year, there is a 90% chance they will not complete high school.
There is the state of Minnesota offers 3 restorative justice professionals who are willing to come out to schools in Minnesota. I have only had one school district ever take advantage of that. I would say another 25 that refused. And it happened when Donald Trump was elected the first time. I represented a lot of young men, mostly boys with disabilities, acted out ways. They're pretty ugly. But were really sort of impulsive boys. I mean, honestly, really lacked much awareness of what they were doing. And the Edina School District was willing to engage in restorative justice with a young man who found his way back into his school. But as a general rule, my experience with this was
no, it's not. And I think there's some things we need to address on that. All right. So one of the things we want to do is we're going to give you the chance here to do a little exchange here. We're a small group, and one of the things that's quite antithetical to C-learning is what's happening now, which is a person just talking at you. That's not supposed to be what C-learning is. That contemplative reflective practice is a process of construction. It's a process of meaning making. Right? You can listen to many presentations or go to conferences, and maybe at the best of it, it's kind of entertaining. It's like a nice little show for a few minutes, but it's not going to change you. It's not going to turn the dial. What turns the dial is this process of reconciliation. So let's use a concrete example for yourselves, and then we'll get into this. Photosynthesis. How many times over the course of your life have you learned about the topic of photosynthesis? So once in elementary school, once in middle school, once in high school, maybe once in college. Maybe 4 or 5 times you've learned about photosynthesis. There's a cursory understanding and there's a more in-depth understanding. Right? And if I were to ask you, individuals that don't have a science background, and I would say, tell me an in-depth definition, understanding of photosynthesis, right? How many of you would go beyond this very light level of like, oh, energy from the sun for plants? Would you tell me about cellular respiration? Would you tell me about the metabolism of sugars? Then the reason you wouldn't do that is not because you didn't hear someone tell it to you, it's because you never learned it. You never reconciled new information with pre-existing knowledge. You never made it meaningful. And it's in that process of meaning making that things stick. Right? We got to latch that on to past experience. Then we've got to build some connections. Why we lose our 6th grade girls when we move into algebra. Because they're not able to see the connections. It's not relevant, it's abstract, it's conceptual. They're far smarter than that. Why would I do this? All right, so as we do this process, I'm going to ask you over the course of this to try and do some of that meaning making for yourself. And I want to hone in on a key concept. There's a couple studies, this isn't like hard science yet. It's more like sociological studies, but one was in the 70s and one was in the 90s, so that's why there's this range here. But communication primarily happens, according to both of these studies, in a nonverbal way. So between 7 and 20% of our communication is verbal. 93 to 80% is nonverbal. My tone, my mannerism, my gesticulation, my facial expressions. Right? And if you ever question that, think about the last time your partner said, no, but it's about the way you said it. So we run into that trap. And the ability to be present with someone is an incredible gift. Like when you connect with someone and they really listen and just you feel heard, that shifts your entire physiology. So we're going to kind of hold that as one of the key practices we can bring into this, because we can train in mindfulness by just being present with another person in front of us. We can be fully present in every aspect of our being to hone in on that. And we're going to ask you to do that here in just a moment. So what we can do is, as you pair up from this, so I'll give you a moment with the actual prompt, is we're going to listen with our whole intention or attention. We're going to listen closely without interrupting. We're not going to give stories or advice, right? We're just going to listen, just take that in. And at the end, we're going to ask or thank the other person for sharing with us, and we're going to maintain some degree of confidentiality. It's not our story to tell. So as we hold these expectations, just as we would with C-learning, because as we practice mindful dialogue, we start to build these skills over and over again. We deepen our understanding of it, which translates really nicely to when we do have to deal with conflict or restorative circle. All right, so what I'd like you to do is just to kind of get a first touch point in C-learning is to grab out your phones very briefly, just for a little bit. This is a sanctioned phone-related thing. And what you're going to do is take a picture of this QR code. Is that coming up for you? Does everybody see the capabilities? Great. So what I'd like you to do is, you won't have time to check them all out. I'm going to give you 2 minutes right now to just read through those. And what I'd like you to do is to select one of them that you think would really help you. Like if you left today with that skill, that competency, how would it help you? How would it help you in your life, in your relationships? What benefit would it bring to you? So take a few moments, try and identify one of them. How could developing skills associated with this component improve your well-being, benefit your life, support your relationships, help you sleep at night? All right, give you another 30 seconds. Pick the one you have, think about why, and how it might benefit you. what I'd like you to do is with someone you didn't come with, which is pretty much everybody, so sorry, pick a person next to you, or you might have to move around a little bit. And what you're going to do is just share for 90 seconds, no, or maybe 60 seconds, I'll time you. You're just going to share which one you picked, why you picked it, and the benefit you think, if you were to have this as a magical superpower, at the end of tonight, what benefit would it bring you? Right? Yeah, we're gonna. How about two? Yeah.
Self-regulation. Yeah, so nobody tell me what to do. I have to make a decision what I want to do. I go to a book school or so I need to go back and watch it, back and look at what's going on, and then get all the information. And then try to adjust it, how much important down after this so with me, you want to be. How about you?
If you haven't switched to the other person, go ahead and switch.
Yep. So
All right, you can wrap up the thought you're on. We'll transition back.
I do great things. And once again, I run down. If I go in, I just put too much in. See me as somebody. So person.
All right, thanks everybody. So as I'm looking out at the group, I can see exactly what we were talking about in terms of that facial expression attunement, right? Smiles are happening, laughter is occurring, connections occurring, right? That is that basic biological capacity that we have towards connection, right? And it is that connection that I'll share some research here that is probably the most important factor in our lives. We can cultivate that, we can develop that. And maybe we'll hear from one or two of you in terms of what was, if you're brave souls out there, what was one of the ones you chose that you think, hey, if I had that one, it would help me. And how would it help you? So maybe we'll hear from two people. Would you be willing to share? Please.
I picked self-compassion.
Self-compassion. Why did you pick that? And how, well, maybe actually let's hold off on the why we picked it. let's focus more on what benefit would it bring you if you were able to cultivate that?
From a broader perspective, I would say the whole world needs compassion. But to achieve that, first of all, the individual should have compassion to oneself. That's why I think sometimes we get carried away and we forget about loving self. So I think that's very important.
Yes. Yeah, it's really hard to sustain the effort if you're depleted. Right? We put the mask on that plane on ourselves first before we put on the child, and I was like, God, that seems not very compassionate. Like what's the deal with that? If I'm passed out, I don't help anybody. I'm a liability. I can't help my kids, and I can't help anybody around me. That's a problem. So we put the mask on ourselves first. Then, once we do that, we can help others. All right, one more. Please.
May I disclose some? So I think the two of us, we both did self-regulation. And well, I think we both are workhorses. I think I was with Lawang on 2 other boards. So we take a lot of responsibilities.
Yeah.
But I think more so, I think because as mothers too, your children are like your mirrors, right, for yourself. She's talking about, I want to learn about managing my own anger and all of these emotions, emotional regulation. And so I think it's something that we're both taking and chatting about.
Sure, absolutely. Great, thank you. So you can see that, these are kind of universal things. Right? These are universal traits. It is these skills that lead to lifetime benefit. Jump into that here a bit as well. All right, so YC learning, we're going to talk a little bit about that in the remaining hour that we have. Practical strategies to build resilience, compassion, and well-being, antidotes to loneliness, burnout, lack of purpose, real insights into the science of resilience and compassion, evidence-based approaches that you can use immediately. Mindful dialogue is something you can use. It is difficult to sit down on a cushion. It is difficult to maintain a daily practice. Your practice can simply be, when I am connecting with someone, I can be fully present with them. They can be the source of my attention training. They can be the basis of my co-regulation. That's a powerful opportunity. How many opportunities do you have throughout your day to do that? So many. Across the board, one of the things, many of you are allies and advocates for Ocean Wisdom. You will communicate with others. You will talk about that. We are stuck and bounded in a paradigm that says, what is the value of school? And many school missions, read the mission of the school. It is not the increased percentage of test scores. It is not additional numbers on your ACT score. I've never seen that in a single school district, ministries of education or stinky little school districts. It's about the development of the person. Good citizens, caring people, prepared, right? 21st century readiness. What we don't recognize and realize is that those kids who got suspended in the first place were lacking this, executive function. They were lacking the ability to have time management, sustained attention, impulse control, flexible thinking, prioritization, emotional control, task initiation. These skills, these executive functioning skills, are the very basis of what Daniel Goleman wrote about in 1995 with emotional intelligence. And it spun off into 2 tracks. One was Harvard Business Review, and they ate it up. It was all about, I'm going to be doing meditation so I can better exploit people, so I can be more focused, right? Now, mindfulness, the movement of mindfulness is completely lacking because in the ancient wisdom tradition, mindfulness was not separated from the practice of compassion and loving kindness. They were 2 pathways for the development of a person. It wasn't just about honing your attention, increasing your concentration. It was about the cultivation of a good heart. So as we bring these together, the pro-social and the skill development of these, but we've got to become fluent with emotional regulation. And in order to do that, I need to know what emotions are. And I don't feel emotions as a concept. I feel emotions in my stomach. When my stomach cramps up and I get worried. And if I don't understand this basic physiology of the fact that when I move into that fight, flight, or fight mode, my digestion stops. I increase my glucose production. My stomach restricts my muscles tension, my heart rate increases, my respiration increases. And when that happens, I'm not paying attention in school.
There's a man named Ross Green who wrote a healthy explosive child. He's a neuropsychologist who worked for a long time at Harvard. And what he tries to explain to teachers and parents is that schools oftentimes, for lack of resources, will rely on reward and punishment systems. But those only work in situations where a child has the skill and he's like, well, maybe a little extra motivation, or the child has a reasonable expectation that behavior we don't really love is actually going to serve them well. And so the kind of stress you place on a child when you create a high-stakes situation where they're supposed to display behaviors they haven't been taught is absolutely, poking the bear. It's a recipe for a meltdown.
Yeah.
So to hear you talk about the importance of actually teaching the skills is a very novel kind of discussion here.
At this school, Ocean Wisdom, and through the journey of C-Learning, we will actually teach kids how to pay attention. It is rampant when we say to kids in school, pay attention, say you're sorry. How to do that? That is a skill set. So that's part of the journey that's going to unfold, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Ryder. So, there's a lot of, you all have heard about SEL movements, so there's like social emotional programs being brought into schools, and then a lot of times they don't last very long, right? So it's kind of like bringing something into the school, and it's not actually the fabric of the school. So what we are trying to do with C-Learning is, we cannot do this in all the cases, in all the schools, but at least with the Ocean Business School, we're trying to do this. Is kind of lay that fabric, which is the foundation, and then we can put in all these other plates like academics, mathematics, all those things we can put on that. So that's something we think is missing in our current education, and from that arises what we're talking about, educating the heart and the mind. So what do we mean by educating the heart? So it comes from, especially if you look at the world today, it's ever more interconnected. So I took this from our C-Learning Companions, which is like a kind of a guide for our C-Learning program. It talks about the framework and everything. So here, this one talks about we live in this interconnected world, and this requires cooperation. Right? We need to understand each other, and then therefore we need because of all these connections that we see, especially with the science, we're able to see this more and more connection. Right? How, with this more understanding, how can we live together in a way that's flourishing and that serves everyone? Right? So that's what the program is trying to do. So compassion is the essence of the program. So that's the value that we're bringing in here. But again, compassion is a very complex construct. So I'll after this, I'll share a little bit about compassion, and we can go from there. So that's where we are coming from. So rather than bringing SEL program into a school, we want to inform the education, like compassion as an education. So not in education. So that's what we're trying to do. And then if you have read the reports from OECD and UNESCO, they talk about how do we prepare our students for it. We need to prepare our students to this, like volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and everything. So how can we do this, right? We cannot just give them content knowledge. So we need to give them these competencies that, their resilience to deal with all these challenges, right? So I think they call this the VUCA model. I think this is something that came up after, Second World War, when the Cold War started, and that's how the strategies are being made based on this model. But again, there's another way of looking at this. Rather than looking at it from a kind of negative perspective, we can look at it from rather than thinking about volatility, we can be more kind of grounded and say, what is our vision? And rather than from uncertainty, what is our understanding? How can you understand the world? And then rather than complexity, rather than saying it's complex, how can we gain clarity, right? So that's where the attention training comes in. How can we be calm and composed, and then we can think through all complex situations that we have to deal with. And then the last is ambiguity. We're not sure what to do. So that's flexibility, the mental flexibility that we need. So the students, it's part of the resilience, right? We're trying to build this resilience. So that in order to do that, they need to be agile, like not just physically, like like the sportsmen, they have to like practice every day, and then they become agile, right? And then similarly with our inner skills, also we need to practice them like, constantly. So that's why in C learning, it's not just that we deliver these programs in a class, but again, it's part of the whole school implementation. So it's built into the routines and inform the parents and get involved with the community as well. So that's how we are going forward. And I'll just be very quick. We are not just bringing our. This program doesn't arrive like in 2019. It's the work of last 30 years. So kind of a lot of these are from Tenzin Sonam, who has wrote this book about at least for the new millennium, and then there's another book called The Secular Ethics, so which informs some of our program, the foundation of our program, and then also Daniel Goleman and Peter Singh is triple focus. How can we cultivate these skills at the personal level, at social, and at the systems level? So that's basically how the program, and they have all these experts who kind of initially, helped create this framework and the curriculums. And then we have this curriculum from like preschool to like K to 12. Basically. So yeah, again, the school, the C learning, if you boil down, it comes down to compassion, right? But again, compassion is understood differently, right? People have different understanding of compassion. So I just want to, open up, and people want to share, like, what comes to your mind when you say compassion?
Others before self, like they have in the TCB.
Others before self?
They have that in the wall at TCB school.
So taking care of others before yourself.
Being kind to others.
Being kind to others.
Walking in their shoes.
Walking in their shoes. Yeah, understanding, empathizing with them. Yeah.
It's funny, I actually think about filling my own cup first and then forgiving myself and finding compassion so I can learn how to show it.
He was sharing earlier about self-compassion, bringing kindness towards yourself first, and experiencing that, and then sharing it out. What else? Yeah. So when we talk about in C learning, we define compassion. It's because it might seem a little bit complicated. When you say warm-hearted, what do you mean, right? I think it's so there is this warm-hearted concern that unfolds when we witness the suffering of others and we feel motivated to relieve it. So when does this warm-hearted come? That's the. If you find something that's if you identify with someone else, right? I think if it's very easy to come within an in-group. So if you are from the same, if it's a family, it's much easier, right? And then as you go further, it becomes more and more difficult. So it's kind of the part of that is the identification, how we identify with other people. So that's that identification comes, once we have this understanding of interdependence. So we in our curriculum we talk about systems thinking and interdependence. So that's kind of understanding of how our well-being and our flourishing are dependent on a lot of other factors and a lot of other people. So that brings us closer to these people and then opens up our hearts. So that's part of it. And then when we witness suffering, right? So I think that's another key part of compassion, that we need to see others suffering. So suffering can manifest in many different ways, right? So first, in order to witness someone else suffering, I think you need to be, like you shared, you need to be calm in order to see someone else suffering. If your mind is agitated, you never see somebody else suffering. So how do we do that, right? Before you do that. So, and then the last part, a lot of times we don't, we see that people are suffering, but we're not able to do it. So we leave it at the motivation level, but we can also be, acting and trying to bring changes also. So there's so first is the affective part. So if you break down compassion, so there are different definitions of compassion and different ways compassion is interpreted. So first is the affective part. So there's the feeling of like caring for someone else. So that's maybe called the tenderness. So like tenderness, how you feel like something is fragile and you want to take care of it. So that's the warmth. So that's the affective part that you need to feel. And then the next is you need to be somebody else's shoes, right? We need to understand someone else. It's kind of like empathizing. But in order to empathize, again, you need to pay attention, right? I think So that attention cultivation becomes key, kind of like very fundamental to compassion as well. And then the last part is the motivation. I mean, you might not be able to help in all the situations, but at least having that motivation, like to help others and to elevate the suffering. That's, I mean, briefly about compassion. So, I mean, this is a exercise. Yeah.
You can take this one. So, you know, and actually, I think we'll move past this, but we'll just use this as a little bit of a thought exercise, which is you have two teachers. One teacher is really strict and stern and focused on what they view as this is how you teach and this is what the academic purpose of learning is. You have another teacher that's quite caring, quite tender, asks about your day, you're excited to see, you have a connection with. A couple questions arise when you envision these two individuals, because we've all had them. You've had both, I guarantee it, to varying degrees. Which teacher did you enjoy being around, or you enjoy going to their class? The answer is kind of obvious. What's also important to that is that there's often a high correlation with the next question. Which teacher did you learn more from? Even if it was a subject you were good at, or even if it's a subject you were interested in, or not interested in, and you weren't good at it, that connection, that attunement, everything that Tenzin just described about compassion, that was there. I also do want to highlight this key piece on empathy. All right, so empathy is an important pathway. It is the very portal for compassion. In order to have empathy, you have to have identification. You've got to identify. So when these two gentlemen shook hands, now all of a sudden there's a shift that occurred, right? They were all part of each other's in-group. They both came here. There was connections that were made. Oh, I am like you. Identification becomes the basis of empathy. That's great. But empathy is not enough. And the problem with empathy is that it activates in the same region of the brain as though we were experiencing the pain ourselves. So if my daughter's cycling outside on the street and she takes a digger and crashes, and she's on the ground crying and her knee is bleeding, and I look out the window and I see that, I am going to experience empathetic distress, as though I myself were experiencing that pain. It activates in the same region of the brain as though that is occurring. When I go to my daughter and I put my arm on her and I assuage her and I put a Band-Aid on that knee, I shift in my brain to the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. I can sustain that for much longer. In fact, I can sustain that indefinitely if it were my own child. That's compassion. So when teachers are experiencing burnout, significant burnout, they continually experience the empathetic distress of a child in need, and they do not have the systems or tools to alleviate their suffering. When that occurs, that teacher experiences lack of agency. I can't do my job. They experience a high degree of depersonalization. It's the kid's fault because I can't keep taking those emotional hits. I can't keep feeling that pain. And when that occurs, the third symptom, which we often think is burnout, is physical and emotional exhaustion. That's actually the last stage of it. Our schools are failing because we are not equipping teachers with the tools that they need. I have never been in a school system that has not been in distress, because no school has ever accomplished what is the reality of public education. There are unlimited needs, and there are very limited resources. And I've been to some of the most wealthy and affluent schools in the world, and they experience the same thing. So recognizing that, fundamentally, we say we're in the business of building good people, the formation of future citizens. It is those tools that Tenzin just highlighted that have to be the basis of it. But many parents, Tiger parents included, feel that academics is first and foremost. People don't get fired because they don't have enough knowledge. They've got cell phones for that. People get fired because they can't apologize. People get fired because they're jerks. Building a good person has much more significant for lifetime returns on all of those factors you want for your child. Sorry.
Yeah. I think.
Oh, this is that second one.
Yeah. You're not doing that.
Yeah. Okay. I think I'll take this again. So the relationship that we've highlighted, I'm going to start moving a little bit more quickly through some of these slides because we are low on time. So there is a relationship between resilience and compassion. As you strengthen your resilience, you strengthen your compassion, and vice versa. In order to do that, we need security priming, which is that basic regulation strategy. Right? It's hard to take that step if you don't have that. So let's use a concrete example. Math tests. How many of you have really bombed a math test in your life? Just bombed it outright. Yeah, absolutely. We have all done it. And you studied for it, and maybe you even knew the content. You knew the information to it. But what happened was you got hijacked by your amygdala. You were stressed, you were worried, you were anxious, and you just fell apart. We can use grounding practices to regulate our nervous system as a math teacher before a kid takes that exam. We can use self-compassion practices. When I hand that exam result back to you, and I prime you with self-compassion, hey, making mistakes is an opportunity for growth. You can't control every external factor. If you were to remember that, and you had done some self-compassion practices in advance, and I hand you that test, would you see yourself as a piece of crap because you did poorly? Maybe not as much. Would you be willing to try a little harder afterwards? Because you tried as hard as you could, and you still failed. What do people do at that point? They switch.
I just want to say I work in various schools, and most recently in North Minneapolis, which is the highest crime, violence, poverty. In the school, the city can try to shut down because of a 35% graduation rate. In a school that used to have 1,200, it was down to 165 limping along. And I was brought in because I have a program I've been doing for 30 years that covers all of this and more. And these boys, part of what they learn is diaphragmatic breathing and focusing. They went, and I worked with the boys' basketball team. It was in last place in the city. In just 3 seasons, they went from worst in the city to state champions, and from a 35 to a 95% graduation rate. Because they learned focusing.
Yeah.
And they also learned about meaning that they get to choose. So that's our interpretation of frontal lobe, not executive function, but you get to choose what things mean. So that they know whatever they get, they can decide, oh, I got a bad grade, it means I got to work harder. It means I can understand what other people are going through when they get a bad report, whatever. But I just want to say, clearly this stuff works.
And we know it. What's helpful now is that there's a wealth of science that supports it. Because to scale this, to bring this to policy members, they need to see that as well. Right?
They need to see results.
Absolutely. And that cognitive reappraisal strategy that you're highlighting. But there's also something more important. People said self-regulation, impulse control. The space between stimulus and response, these aren't my words, this is Viktor Frankl, who's a Holocaust survivor. The space between stimulus and response is our ability to choose. And it's in that choice that we gain our freedom. Those kids gained that freedom when they didn't react. The prevalence of violent crimes and alcohol. What does alcohol do? It inhibits inhibitory response control, right? It limits that. It shortens the distance. We react much harder. We're training to do the opposite. All right. There is a wealth of science and research in every one of these fields. Resilience, positive outlook, attention training, and gratitude. I could take any one of these and say there is a subset field that has significant benefit physiologically. Reduction in hypertension, reduction in cancer likelihood, reduction in, all of these, obesity, so forth. All of these correlate. Every single one of them has a research basis now. We can engage in all of these practices. Now, how do we do that as adults? It's a little bit more challenging. But when we're most nimble as students to cultivate this, because neurons that fire together wire together. So we build those skills and we do that repetition. We create activities, learning experiences. And then in the routines, when the kid comes in from the hallway, when we have to navigate a grounding practice before a test, we reinforce that. I'm going to be brief with this. We've talked a lot about this. This is a tool and a strategy we call the resilience zone. So this autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, sympathetic being our fight, flight, fright response, parasympathetic being our rest and digest response. Rest and digest is the best possible condition that I can learn. And there are many kids that you describe who are always in that hyper stress response. In a normal cortisol day, we ramp up, and then we get to the evening, we start to ramp down. And that's the cycle of our lives, right? We get into our car and it ramps up. We interact with school, ramps up. But then we get home and ramps down. And that's okay, that's normal. Individuals who experience acute trauma, they're always at that level. A chair drops in a room and they panic. Somebody cuts them off and they're ready to go. That's the more severe elements of this.
Hello, library guests. The library is closed in half an hour at 7 p.m. We will reopen tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thank you.
That announcement was from me. I got you, buddy. That was a little passive aggressive. All right, we're not gonna have time for this, but I do want to highlight this as a key strategy that we have in C learning. This is a tool that helps us to understand our physiology. It's called the Resilience Zone, and it's coming in from Elaine Miller-Karras's Trauma Resource Institute. The Resilience Zone is, and I hear about it, I know. Well, actually, you don't understand it, I do, but we'll cut it down. Okay, I'll deliver that. So you can call it the OK zone, you can call it the well-being zone, you can call it the resilience zone, whatever you need to call it. But if you come into a C-learning classroom, many C-learning classrooms do this, a kid comes in and they say, where are you at in your zone of resilience? And the kid says, I'm here. So imagine there was another scale here of a 1 to 5. And the kid says, I'm a 2. And I know as a teacher right away where that kid is at. If that kid says I'm a 5, ooh, I also know where that kid is at. And I can use different strategies to help them to regulate. But I need to know that. I can't just intuit it, because there's kids that smile at me and there's kids that frown at me. And I have bias, and I like the kids that are nice to me and say hi, and I think they're pretty great. And I don't like the kids who are mean to me and grumpy and difficult. But if I had a more objective measure, and I could look at this as they come in and they can read it and connect with it, it's an incredibly powerful tool. So what I'd like for you to do is answer these questions for yourself. And let's take just a moment to highlight what is the high zone. The high zone is rage, anger, frustration, intensity, right? That's the high zone. That's when you just get cut off at 6 p.m. as you're trying to get home. The low zone is you hear some sad news. You experience something a little problematic. The key thing in C learning is not to stop you from going into the high zone or the low zone. You're a human being, you will go there. The focus, the purpose of C learning is not to get stuck there. Because when you get stuck there, you are bounded in that. Your decision making falls apart, your capacity to support your well-being falls apart, and you are greatly inhibited in your ability to engage in compassionate responses for yourself and others.
Is there a sweet spot in terms of class size where you utilize these skills?
That's a different conversation. And I don't, no, but it's an important one. I personally don't think so. In fact, we can talk about this. There's a thing called the Tennessee STAR study, and it's one of the most important longitudinal studies for social emotional learning, early childhood. And the purpose of that study, it was in Tennessee, it was about with 15,000 kids, was to measure the impact of small classes. Small classes didn't really matter. What matters was the quality of the teacher and their capacity for differentiation. But what was really cool, and this was by a guy named Raj Chetty, who's a Harvard economist. This is an economics review, not an education one. What he did was he looked at the classrooms that applied what we now call social emotional learning and the classrooms that didn't. And what they found is that the classrooms that use social emotional learning early on, those kids, these are people my age, so these are individuals that were in kindergarten between 1985. I was in kindergarten in 1987, so I'm part of that scope. I'm 43. Individuals that received social emotional learning from the kindergarten teachers had higher lifetime earnings, higher home ownership rates, less likelihood for incarceration, and more likelihood for college completion. More important than class size was the building of that. And I think for me personally, the embodiment on behalf of a teacher, the really holding of it. Those teachers that you had in your mind, they weren't trained in C learning, but they were practitioners of C learning, no doubt.
But if you're differentiating, I mean, there has to be like an hour limit, and I'm just, you don't have to answer that now, but as you think
You
about.
caring teachers, right, they care.
Yes, yes.
Ultimately, they care.
No, but my thinking was that you have to differentiate, there has to be an hour limit, and obviously that's something that has to be considered as you think about kind of what your school.
You're completely right. I mean, this is a world where you have huge range between needs and neurodiversity and behavioral diversity. That's a
And I already
condition.
answered, I'm just.
Yeah, it's a fair point.
I'm riffing, really.
Yeah.
Differentiation then describes a way of teaching academics. So that's a box.
Yeah.
In my mind.
Yeah, it's a fair point. And I'm describing, maybe it's not differentiation, maybe it's attunement. Attunement to the needs of the child. Because that attunement is going to go so much farther than anything else that can occur. And it's the ability for the teacher not to be burnt out themselves, because when that happens, I mean, one of the key strategies that they use for suicide prevention in secondary school is for a teacher to be that first responder. When the teacher is completely exhausted physically and emotionally, it's very hard to read the cues of a child.
Who did the research about early social emotional learning and then, higher
Yeah.
rates of home ownership?
So
whatever?
Raj Chetty was one of them, but there's a bigger guy who actually got a Nobel
So
Prize.
was it individual or was it an institution?
Oh, yeah, it's the School of Economics at the University of Chicago. There's a gentleman by the name of James Heckman. Because of his research and the field that he helped to create, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics for this research on early childhood, for social emotional learning and early childhood education.
James Heckman?
James Heckman, that's right. All right. This study is maybe the most important study that I want to offer today, and why Ocean of Wisdom matters to you, for you. You take 1,000 Harvard students. They're the best. They're so good. You take 1,000 latchkey kids in Boston, just kids on the street, in the 1930s. Right. Every year, intensive multi-hour survey. Every second year, health screenings that have advanced to using MRIs now. Every third year, in-person interviews. Huge wealth of data. Not just them, their kids and their grandkids. This is the longest longitudinal study the world has ever seen. There are other longitudinal studies that corroborate what I'm about to say. When you ask the question at the end of this study, you say, what's the secret sauce? What leads to a good life? The strongest factor that contributes to longevity, how long a person will live, is positive relationships. Doesn't matter as much how much a person drank, and this is after the age of 50, how much a person drank, how much a person exercised, how much bacon they had on Saturday morning. It is positive relationships that determines longevity. Now let's take this a little step further. This is maybe original research we could substantiate. What is a positive relationship in your life? It's your family, it's your friends, but maybe it's that person in college who stepped up when you most needed it. And you don't hear from them for like 20 years, and they come out of the woodworks and they say, hey, and you open your home to them because they engaged with you with genuine compassion when you needed it most. Those are the positive relationships that define our life. And I think compassion, the desire to alleviate the suffering of others with tenderness and care, is the basis of any significant positive relationship we have, real relationship. So we are in the business at Ocean of Wisdom and with Sea Learning in building the skills that we need for connection, for positive relationships. This is about 20 years old. One of my undergrads was in economics. $80,000 was the cutoff point 20 years ago. So it's probably inflated to like maybe $120,000 now. I don't know. But let's just say $80,000 was the cutoff then. At $80,000 more in terms of income, happiness did not increase. It plateaued and then it started to decrease as you made more money. There is a fabrication and a mythology that we perpetuate with this notion. And I'm a child of immigrants. Right? I've been through 3 naturalization processes in my family alone. There is a false belief that academic achievement is going to lead to success because some of these bright, wicked bright kids are some of the most anxious, some of the most lacking in self-compassion, and some of the most dysregulated. We also know that the trauma we experienced passes on. It's called epigenetics. So What I'm getting to here is it requires a shift, just as you spoke to, in yourselves as parents. It requires a shift for me as a parent. I'm a parent of a 14-year-old. I've got a kid in high school now. I've got a 7th grader. I need to become a different parent if they're going to be successful. Because success cannot be guided by it. And I know your love is genuine. I have no doubt in my mind of that. Because at the end of the day, you want them to be happy. You're just bounded by this notion that happiness is the good job, is the amount of money you make, is the good college you attend, is the success you have in high school so you can get to the good college. Reality is that's not measures of happiness, genuine. And it's not measures of physiological longevity. All right. There's a lot of research. There's an entire field of social emotional learning. We're a part of it. C-Learning is designated as a Castle Select program. It means it has the highest ranking by the organization, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, which was going to be a conference here, and we were going to attend. It's an important organization that has helped build the field, of which Daniel Goleman is a founding member. So when Daniel Goleman called for SEL 2.0, because it wasn't really hitting the mark, and he asked for things like systems thinking, attention training, resilience, compassion for self and others. And when he said C-Learning was SEL 2.0, he meant it. It is what the field has been calling for. It is an evolution of where we need to go. Because it's not just mindfulness for mindfulness' sake. It's just going to lead to a bunch of focused, strung out executives. And look, lo and behold, what has it done? Perspective taking, self-confidence, feelings of empathetic concern. These are research-based outcomes of C-Learning. There is a lot more research that will unfold as we take this journey together. I am hopeful. Having been to a lab school myself through my middle school experience, where I went to the Wyoming Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence, which was called PrEP. It was at the University of Wyoming, and I had 3 years during the most critical time in my life. I had 2 arrests by the age of 15, barely graduated high school, and that middle school saved. This can be a lab school. This can be a lab school that defines excellence for what C-Learning can become for the world. We can try some things out. We can do some things. You have the Emory University as we explore this. There are a few other lab schools around the world, but this could be our first in the United States to really define what is compassion training in education.
That was one of my questions, was what kind of resource Emory might be, particularly where you might have an educational challenge, where you need, somebody who could do good psychometric testing.
Yeah.
You need somebody who's got, are they an educational resource for your students?
Yeah, absolutely. This network and community is one. But also our prioritization, one of the hopes that we have, and I'll just be candid with it, we got Castle Select in 2024. The COVID pandemic was a little bit of a bummer because we launched in 2019 and it took us a little while to get that research basis going and Castle Select to occur. But now that we have that, this is the basis for us to grow domestically. It is kind of the gatekeeper. It's the basis by which schools say, yeah, it's a good program, it's research-based, let's look at the list. We're on that list now. I hope that Minneapolis can be a hub for the training of C-Learning facilitators, for the training and building of capacity for administrators, retired, and that we can use this as a generative tool to bring C-Learning throughout the United States. It has to start somewhere. So yes, our full resources and focus are absolute. I wouldn't be here if this wasn't a priority. So I don't know exactly what it looks like in terms of, are we going to provide those universal screeners? I don't know, but we could employ our research team to help develop them.
Just a thorny,
Yeah.
educational situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely, but we're going to figure it out together because we have the skills as practitioners in education and the engagement and support of the center and the university. But I'm going to get to a few things that I think it would be beneficial to have some Q&A. So let me just jump through this just a little bit because I do want to get to, I think I've spoken about this. This is that research of James Heckman. His research drew from a research study that was in the early 60s, and this was in Ypsilanti, Michigan. So it worked with students, poor Black kids, and it had different control groups and non-control groups, intervention groups. And what they determined, these are individuals 20 years older than I am, demonstrating these lifetime outcomes. So again, you're going to, as you talk about the school, interface with people and say, look, academics first, then the soft, touchy-feely stuff second. The reality is, that it's not an either or proposition with the school. In fact, the academics will be successful when that occurs, right? All right, I'm gonna jump through this, apologize. Yeah, let's open it up to Q&A or.
Yeah. Just the last slide. Please. I'll just take just a couple of things. So these are the curriculums that we have for the program from preschool. We just launched the preschool curriculum, and then we have a high school curriculum. So from preschool to high school, we have a full curriculum. So again, I mean, in order to deliver the curriculum, we need the educators familiar with the output C-learning. So we have the CBCD program. So that's the cognitively-based compassion training, which is for the adults. So for that, I mean, we have, these are the modules. And if you, I mean, it's very similar to what C-learning, how C-learning is also structured. So we have these chapters that goes from that. So these are kind of like body-based literacy. We call it body literacy. So like understanding how, I mean, stress and joy and all those have
Hello,
effects on
library
our body.
guests. The library is closed
And then going into attention training.
computers automatically
These kind
shut
of
down
go
in 10
together.
minutes
I
at
think
6:55. So please print or save your work. Thank you.
Which one is it? So one that has all this. Anyway, so the first part, I mean, first part of these 5 modules is kind of like interpersonal skills, so like develop these skills yourself, and then that builds your resilience, and then the next part with these 8 modules are kind of like how can we interpersonal skills, right? So how can we kind of apply that to a community and how they apply to a systems level. So that, and then I mean, these leads to compassion, and then resilience and compassion, I mean, that's the composition of well-being. We have well-being things. We can never be like free of adversity or challenges, right? I think we need to prepare kids. I mean, who have this. I mean, even though I mean, kids are stressed. I mean, my daughter goes to studying a freshman. She's stressed. So if they can have these skills early, I mean, they can start experiencing these well-beings early on, and then as they grow, I mean, they have these skills. Because life when it's uncertain and you always face these challenges. So how do you deal with this, right? So that's I mean how I mean the more resilience you have, the more compassion you have, and the more compassion you have, it acts as kind of like a cycle that keeps adding. So that's the CBCD program, and our curriculum for C-learning also kind of overlaps very similar. So we develop these skills.
I just briefly to add to that, one of the things that's just literally happened 3 weeks ago, we launched what's called the Compassion Shift. The Compassion Shift was a initiative supported by the Walton Foundation to take this model and tailor it to the fields of healthcare, business leadership, and mental health, and education. We have received not just recognition from CASEL for C-learning, we've now received recognition as a research-based protocol for the adult SEL. The unification of teacher SEL and student SEL right at the forefront, where a teacher doesn't have to reconcile, especially at the high school level. I'm not a counselor, I'm a math teacher. Why am I doing this? When that teacher is able to say, hey, unless I deal with these social emotional pieces, it inhibits my ability to be an effective math teacher. That recognition, that fluency, that science-based informing, they may not be meditation practitioners or contemplative practitioners, but what they won't be is a barrier to the implementation of this programming in their school. They'll understand why. Because what we don't build with kids, we often don't build with the adults in our schools. We don't give them adequate professional development. We don't give them an understanding of why we're doing something. And we add more to their full plate. We have to shift the paradigm to help them see this is not something to add to the plate, this is the plate. This is the very foundation of teaching and learning. We are starting to experience schools coming on board, and I would highly encourage, because CASEL does as well, before you implement student SEL, you need to implement adult SEL. You need to help them to understand why they're doing it. You need to create and ensure a certain degree of buy-in, because if you rush into the student implementation, you will fail, because 90% of student SEL programs within 5 years are no longer at that school. So I think let's open up some questions, but I saw Brian, you had a hand.
Yeah. And what role do students play in your training of adults?
Oh, that's a great question. They don't at this point. But let me tease that out a little bit. What are you thinking there? What do you envision?
Well, I do a lot of work with high school recording arts, which is hip hop high.
Yeah.
And students are part of this.
The process.
They declare what they want to learn.
Yeah.
And the adults say, well, how can we facilitate
That's great.
this? And it's all done within a family context, a loving context. I mean, it's right out there in the open.
It's a whole child school.
Let me come back to that in terms of a potential example as a through line. This never reached beyond feasibility piloting study, but it was a study that was done with transgender youth and their parents. And they each received CBCT separately. And then the research intervention was actually the car ride home. So the car ride home was then recorded and documented, and the conversation, because we primed them for that. So in the early days, before C-learning came to what it was, CBCT was applied as an intervention to adolescents. And in that way, I think it's entirely possible. However, C-learning and CBCT have become increasingly unified. CBCT uses the resilience zone, and it came from C-learning. So our model, curriculum integration model, and the high school model can, and the method for bringing that can absolutely be peer-led. We've had numerous programs say, I want to do a peer-led approach. So these students are taught C-learning, and then they teach underclassmen. One of the things that could occur based on this idea is that we create a cadre of CBCT certified teachers, and the 18 is kind of the mark because you're dealing with some pretty heavy things regarding self-compassion and liability and so forth with Emory. However, whether it's C-learning or CBCT, absolutely we can create a student-centered approach. But let me come to that one and I'll come back to you.
I was wondering, we talk a lot about having an environment that's built from the bottom up with the C-learning elements, ethics, but a big emphasis on compassion. And I was wondering, have you done studies on the successful schools? What are the elements of that environment that you put in place? How do we keep up with the necessary evolution of that so that we have an environment that really functions for the school?
Right.
Yeah, one of my colleagues, she's involved, she's doing the homeschool innovation research. So one of my colleagues, she's a researcher, so I'm not working on that research, but I think we have those data in terms of like what makes these schools successful, and in terms of like how can we bring in these SEL programs into the schools. So it's once it's ready, we share.
There's a methodology for it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
The thing that I wanted to say was, it seems to me that the teachers have such an important necessity of embodying and being reflexive with these expressions of compassion. It has to just be reflexive. So I don't know how one goes about hiring people that are happy and balanced and all of those things, but it seems to me that it's a huge task to have reflexively compassionate people.
I think it does anchor to actually the first question. One of the things I know, regardless of what this research tells me, and I'm sure the research will indicate this, but I just know the fiber of my being, school leaders play an important role in setting the culture and tone of a school. I know that. They inform the psychological safety of the people around you, and just as a classroom teacher does. Their embodiment of this is the tip of the spear to set that tone. So yes, can it be trained? I mean, I'll give you a concrete example. I'm working with the International School Basel. They're a system of about 2,000. They have 3 campuses, and they brought cognitively based compassion training because they said, hey, we want C-learning. How should we do it best? And I said, well, if you want to do it best, train your teachers in compassion. So they brought cognitively based compassion training. But you don't just throw that at people. You don't force this. This is not something you force on somebody else. So what we did is we started with the leadership team. We did a 1-day taste of CBCT training. They experienced it as a core team because it kind of makes sense, right? Like there's not too much to reconcile here. It's like, oh, right. They said this would be valuable to bring to the whole staff, but we couldn't just throw it at them. We had to build that. We had to build that line. We had to introduce them to some things. We had to set, and those leaders had to know what it was so they could have those hallway conversations with those grumps that they know are going to be resistors. Hey, here's what it is. Here's why we're doing it. Here's the process we're taking. here's how it occurs, because they need to be front-loaded, right? Don't force something on me. And the product of that, their headmaster, he's a good dude, but he is a dude. He is a big, gruff South African man. And I stayed at his home. It was the very first time in his entire life he had ever cooked a vegetarian meal, right? So this gives you a caricature of who this guy is, right? He is very quintessential. He led in preparation for this, a mindfulness practice with his whole staff. When a person like that engages with this at that level, when they say, they set the tone, they set the climate, and they set the expectations. Once you get to critical mass, you can implement this, but it takes time and it's a process. It's not a quick fix. But yeah. Other thoughts or questions? Insights or questions?
If nobody else has one.
Yeah, please.
So I am familiar with the high school that Mr. Sonam referenced. It's a really, really interesting, the high school for performing arts.
No, I school for recording arts.
I'm sorry, recording, yeah, I missed, I missed. It's with Scotty Hero.
Yes.
Okay, so it's a really interesting school that is very much about a local child. So an interesting place to think about, where there might be people who are interested in this.
Yeah, you're gonna find those quirky places with those quirky people who are willing to take chances, like look at the room here. So, we try something out because fundamentally what we're doing is not working, right? The system is broken. And if we keep doing things the same way and expecting different results, that's Einstein's definition of insanity. So let's try and bring in some discernment here.
I think systems integration from the large part of the curriculum. And how do you reconcile that if you as you want to kind of shift, it's a cultural shift, and you're kind of asking people to values and then outside of the school, right? The larger society of, let's say, in America, the value of education is generally not
Individualistic.
like funding for schools for everything great expensive. That is also the larger signaling that is implicitly implied.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile with that? Why do you want to do something like whatever?
Sure.
Yeah, it's a challenge, it's a changing culture, right, at different levels, and I think we're trying to do our part, so that's why we have this CPC, business and mental health and health workers and everything, so I think that shift,
Hello, library is closing.
compassion
If
shift.
you have any questions or any
Compassion
books to
shift,
check
so
out,
how can we
please come
bring
to
this
the
back? I
desk
think
now.
it's going to be gradual.
Please check the space
I
around
think
you
people are
as you get up to
realizing
leave.
it. I think
We
people know
reopen
this.
tomorrow
it's-
at 10 a.m.
it's very difficult
Thank you.
to implement and these skills that we're trying to address. These are something that are not concrete and something that we can capture and measure, especially for research. It's very difficult to measure these competencies. Like we need to measure these in a real context, right? We cannot just do the abstraction. So
I just want to say, I'm chair of the education committee for Minneapolis NAACP, and we have as part of our mission systems change, because we just do little things here and there. For instance, mental health, you want to help mental health, change it. All they want to do is hire mental health workers, go into schools and identify at younger and younger ages, anxiety, depression. It's all about feeding big pharma. And so this is not just a little one-off about social emotional learning, it's getting in there and realizing that all the systems are geared towards a lot of dysfunction that profits certain individuals in certain industries.
The ice approved the last 60 seconds.
I'm going to take 20 seconds and I'll deal with him. But this may not feel like satisfactory, especially in the tails of that. I agree with you that to be committed, to bring forth that transformation, to really look at it from a systems approach, and to understand the implicit and overt influencing factors. With that said, one of the posters I have in front of my workspace is a poster of His Holiness Dalai Lama, and it's a quote that reads, in order to change the world around me, I first have to change myself. So I would offer that changing oneself and changing a school becomes the basis of a community's transformation. And my doctoral research was in sustainability education. I thought initially that it was, you teach a kid to recycle, you build the value set, you build behavior, they're going to recycle the rest of their life. That's pretty powerful. That's a longitudinal effect.